You know, for decades, Hollywood, the media, and airlines themselves have glamorized flight attendants as having a fast-paced, fun-filled, globe-trotting lifestyle. But the thing is, among other problems in the industry, there is a problem with that depiction, right? Because not only is it often inaccurate, in some cases, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because while many may love the opportunities the job offers, there are things specific to this line of work that make turning it into a career an incredible challenge, even leading to some facing homelessness and hunger. Because, you know, on paper, airlines promise flight attendants double-digit hourly rates, but the actual take-home pay doesn't really reflect that. You see, many flight attendants only get about 75 hours of hourly pay a month, but they're actually working a lot more. And that's because at most airlines, flight attendants aren't clocking paid time until the aircraft doors are closed. All the time outside of flying hours, right? The time spent at the airport waiting for their next flight, the time that it takes to get people and their bags on board and in their proper places, and the time to get everyone off, that is either unpaid or paid at a fraction of the hourly rate. In fact, there's only one major airline that actually pays flight attendants for boarding time, and that's Delta, which is interesting because they're also the only major US airline whose flight attendants are not unionized. Though notably, in 2022, after and possibly because of a huge push to unionize, that's when Delta decided to begin paying flight attendants during boarding. But still notably, they only began paying flight attendants at half their hourly rate for the 40 to 50 minutes scheduled for boarding. And if you've ever flown, you know it's not at all uncommon for that to take even longer, not to mention the fact that flight attendants often have to be at the airport long before and after boarding. Right in Canada, for example, where flight attendants also are not paid for non-flight hours, it's estimated that flight attendants work an average of 35 hours every month without being paid. And on the American side, Rich Henderson, a longtime flight attendant who runs the Two Guys on a Plane meme account with his husband, he told the Washington Post, it's pretty common to work 6 hours of flight time, but you're actually working for 12 to 14 hours. Saying we have a lot of time at work, we don't get paid. And all of this is especially hard on people just breaking into the industry. I mean, for one, most flight attendants have to first attend training for about 3 to 6 weeks, and that training is often unpaid. And then, even more than that, most new flight attendants work what's known as on reserve, meaning they can sometimes spend days waiting to be assigned flights. And so according to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median pay for flight attendants was a little less than $70,000 in 2023. But the projected yearly pay for first-year flight attendants is much lower than that. In fact, according to numbers provided by America's largest flight attendants union, the AFA, it is roughly $23,000 at Frontier, $25,000 at Alaska, $27,000 at American, and $32,000 at Delta. And in fact, just this year, an employment verification letter from American Airlines showing a projected starting pay of just over $27,000 per year recently went viral, with some calling that a poverty verification letter that could be used to apply for government assistance programs like food stamps. And to that point, when flight attendants, especially early career flight attendants, are complaining about their pay, it's not just that they feel like they deserve more, it's that they're literally barely scraping by. With the Washington Post, for example, interviewing 18 current or former flight attendants and finding that it is common for them to take side jobs like bartending and truck driving, or even being makeup artists and church musicians. And this, as some said, that they were struggling to feed their families or they're living out of vehicles. And you know, that tracks with what the AFA is saying. Right in a news release from this year, the union claimed that many members have reported financial insecurity, including some that have, quote, experienced homelessness, lived in their car, lived in a shelter, or endured some combination of these circumstances. And in fact, there's a Facebook group for Alaska Airlines flight attendants experiencing hunger and homelessness that's grown to nearly 800 members. And then also, I mean, there's these groups with thousands of members to help flight attendants find what are known as crash pads, which, you know, is just shared group housing where people rotate in and out on a temporary basis, which is something necessary because the hubs of major airlines are typically all the biggest and most expensive cities in the US. And with that, you had several flight attendants who spoke to the Post saying they are angry that they make less than they would be working comparable hours at a fast food restaurant despite their extensive safety responsibilities, regular training, and demanding lifestyle. Now with that, you know, I will say everyone deserves a living wage. This is not about putting one group of everyday workers against another group of everyday workers. But at the same time, of course, you might get their frustration. I mean, for one, flight attendants have to be ready to deal with all types of emergencies, right? I mean, they get weeks of initial training and yearly refreshers on things like providing onboard first aid and administering CPR. With lithium batteries increasingly overheating and sparking fires on board planes, they're ready to fight fires. And then, of course, if shit really hits the fan, they're supposed to be ready to lead the evacuation. Plus, on top of all that, many flight attendants say that their jobs have just gotten harder since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020. But I mean, one, they obviously had to worry about exposure to the virus itself, but then also two, they were having to enforce controversial rules like the mask mandate and having to deal with just a surge in dickhead passengers. And that, along, of course, with airlines being hit, their profits generally dropping. Though there, I will say the CEOs of Delta and American, for example, each made more than $31 million last year. Also, regarding pay, going back to those unpaid hours, airlines have tried to argue that those hours are actually compensated, with, for example, a statement on Alaska Airlines website saying, contrary to union narratives, we do pay flight attendants for boarding time through a pay mechanism that was negotiated with the union in previous contract cycles. But notably, the statement statement doesn't detail what the mechanism is. And according to Sarah Nelson, the president of the AFA, which represents flight attendants at Alaska and a number of other airlines, that statement, at the very least, is misleading. Where she says that it is common for airlines to guarantee 1 hour of paid flight time for every 2 hours on duty. So let's say a flight attendant gets to the airport early in the morning for their first flight and finishes up their day 12 hours later. In that case, they are guaranteed 6 hours of pay, even if they're not in the air for 6 hours. But of course, for everyone else, that sounds crazy, right? If an employer is asking for 12 hours of your time, you expect to be paid for 12 hours. In fact, you probably think that it's required by law, but notably, in this case, it's not. You see, flight attendants and other aviation workers, they're largely exempt from something called the Fair Labor Standards Act because their job is considered essential to the economy. And notably, that's not the only way that being deemed essential is a disadvantage, right? Because under federal law, it's actually illegal for airline workers to strike unless they get permission from the federal government. And weirdly, that's because of something called the Railway Labor Act, which places severe restrictions on the ability of railroad employees to go on strike when a contract expires, but since 1936, it's also applied to airline workers. And basically, what it means today is that when a union wants to negotiate its contract, it can file for a federal mediation. And if then negotiations come to a standstill, the union or company management can ask federal mediators involved to declare an impasse. And then, if that happens, the union can go on strike or management can lock out union workers after 30 days. But then, the president can also step in at the last moment and order workers to stay on the job for 2 additional month-long cooling off periods while trying to come up with another solution. And then finally, if the two sides still can't reach a deal during that 60-day period, Congress could step in and stop the strike. And a huge thing here is that that is what happened a couple of years ago when Congress voted to force a contract on rail workers unions to keep the railways operating. And so with that, some say that it is very likely that Congress would do the same if any of the 4 major carriers tried to go on strike. And in fact, last November, for example, federal mediators refused to declare an impasse to stop American Airlines flight attendants from striking. And actually, the last time a major airline was grounded by a strike was 25 years ago when Northwest Airlines pilots went on strike for 2 weeks, which notably, Northwest was the 4th largest US airline back then. But since then, the 11 largest US airlines have merged to become the 4 largest carriers today, which carry about 80% of US air traffic between them, which then also means that the government's going to be even less likely to approve a strike, right? Because the impact of that, it would just be massive. And so with that, you have people like Julie Hedrick, a flight attendant for American Airlines and president of another union, the APFA, saying UPS, Writers Guild, the Actors Guild, and not that they've all gone on strike, but they've pushed it to that point and they've been able to get the contracts that they deserve. But then also, with all that said, voting to authorize the strikes, even though they'll likely never happen, that's still a common negotiating tactic taken during talks, right? And there has been some progress. For example, since COVID-19 put a pause on most contract negotiations, airline workers across the industry have been pushing their employers for pay increases and better working conditions. First, you had pilots at all 4 major airlines winning billions of dollars worth of raises in the past couple of years. And now we're seeing flight attendants really stepping up their efforts. For example, in February, tens of thousands of flight attendants across 3 different labor unions and several airlines held protests at over 30 major airports across the US. And at that time, flight attendants at most of the largest airlines hadn't received pay increases since before the pandemic, but over 2/3 of flight attendants in the US were in new union contract negotiations. With this then seeing in April, just a few months after a union representing Southwest flight attendants voted to authorize a strike, they ratified an agreement to raise pay about 33% over 4 years. And also that month, you had Delta Airlines raising their pay by around 5%, possibly due to another attempt to get flight attendants to unionize. And then last summer, American Airlines flight attendants landing a new contract. But still, with all that, while these deals seem like pretty big wins for the unions, we haven't necessarily seen the kind of sweeping changes that some have been hoping for. And of course, at other airlines, the fight is still on. With us seeing, for example, in August, United Airlines flight attendants overwhelmingly voting to authorize a strike, and flight attendants at Alaska Airlines, which is the country's 6th largest carrier, rejecting a new contract. And in fact, to connect it to the election that's coming up, well, it's not a top 5 issue according to polls for most Americans. For people in the industry, it's worth noting that while Biden has been cracking down on airlines, Trump has generally had policies backed by the companies. And this is a lot of people say that Trump's record is anti-union. Though again, really no matter the president, it does feel like the system and we'll say recent history has not put many of these workers in a good position, either now or in ability to negotiate. But like with so many things we talk about on this show, for now, we'll have to wait to see what happens. And of course, in the meantime, especially if you are someone in the industry, I'd love to know your thoughts.